The afternoon sun spread lazily over the small inland town when my car gave its first warning signal on the dashboard. A red light blinked intermittently, followed by a concerning sputter from the engine. I cursed under my breath as I guided the car to the shoulder of the main street, a quiet road lined with simple houses and small shops. There was no choice but to seek help. After a quick search on my phone, I found the only nearby option: Thiago's workshop. The simple name contrasted with the sophisticated, well-lit offices I was used to, but at that moment, it hardly mattered. I drove cautiously to the indicated address, crossing cobblestone streets, where a few children still played on the sidewalks, and finally parked in front of a modest but well-kept shed. As I stepped out of the car, the smell of grease mixed with the warm afternoon air enveloped me. I was greeted by Thiago, a man of average height, his hands stained with oil and a calm expression on his face. He looked at me with the patience of someone who had seen many frustrated drivers before, but without any hurry, he wiped his hands on an old rag and asked what had happened. I explained the problem impatiently, while he simply nodded and began lifting the car hood, as if he didn't need more details to understand the situation. It was then that I noticed the boy. Pedrinho, with his 6 years of pure energy, was playing with some plastic cars on the sidewalk, creating stories only he understood. The little boy laughed to himself as he made the vehicles crash and then rescue each other, like in an improvised action movie. From time to time, he glanced at his father, as if making sure he was still there, and then returned to his own world of play. The boy's spontaneous and carefree demeanor contrasted with the way I carried on my shoulders. Somehow that simple scene, the father immersed in his work, the son playing nearby, secure just knowing his father was there, stirred something in me more than I could admit. Thiago confirmed that it would take a few days to fix the car. With no alternative, I left the vehicle there and went on my way, bidding farewell with a quick wave. But as I walked away, I felt that this wouldn't be the last time I'd set foot in that place. When I returned to the workshop to pick up the car, the afternoon was warm, and the golden sunlight filtered through the gaps in the roof, casting beams of light onto the grease-stained cement floor. The place had the familiar smell of oil and heated metal, but this time that wasn't the only thing that caught my attention. There was a strange sense of recognition as I crossed the entrance of the shed, as if the place no longer felt so foreign to me. Thiago was leaning against a car, just like the first time, wiping his hands with a grimy cloth. When he saw me, he looked up and smiled, a subtle but genuine smile, as if he had been expecting me. There was no rush to talk about the car, and soon the conversation drifted to something more personal. It was there, among scattered tools and the distant sound of Pedrinho playing on the sidewalk, that Thiago mentioned his struggle for custody of his son. He spoke casually, as if he had grown accustomed to carrying that burden alone, but I saw beyond his calm voice. The boy's mother had disappeared years ago, and since then he had been fighting a solitary battle against bureaucracy and prejudice. Perhaps it was the weariness in his expression or the resigned tone in which he spoke, but something inside me shifted. The lawyer in me recognized the complexity of the situation, but the man who had long felt an emptiness that success couldn't fill, realized that this was more than just a legal case. I offered my help without hesitation. What began as a professional gesture soon became an excuse to meet more often. At first, our meetings were strictly about the case, but as the days passed, the barriers between us dissolved. Thiago began to trust me in a way few people did. He spoke about the difficulties of raising Pedrinho alone, the sleepless nights when the boy fell ill, the fear of failing as a father. In return, I shared my own restlessness, the weight of loneliness, the feeling that no matter how impeccable my career was, something essential was slipping through my fingers. And then there was Pedrinho, always nearby, always curious. He loved hearing my stories about the courtroom, asked questions that made us laugh, and without realizing it, became the piece that connected us. Gradually, what started as a casual encounter at the workshop turned into something bigger. I found myself there more often, not just because of the case, but because, in some way, that small world made me feel part of something I hadn't known I needed. That night, after a prolonged meeting at the office, I decided to stop by the workshop to update Thiago on the progress of the case. The sky was heavy, and the hot, Humid air foretold an impending storm. As soon as I parked in front of the shed, the first drops began to fall, quickly turning into a dense curtain of rain. Thiago, who was closing up the workshop, greeted me with a surprised look, but his expression soon relaxed into a faint smile. As I explained the reason for my visit, a distant thunder rumbled, and the force of the storm caused the power to flicker for a moment. He glanced at the waterlogged street and insisted I stay until the rain passed. Reluctantly, but with few other options, I accepted the invitation. Thiago's house was just behind the workshop, a simple but cozy space. As I entered, I was greeted by the comforting aroma of home-cooked food still lingering in the air. The walls were decorated with Pedrinho's drawings, colorful scribbles depicting cars, people, and scenes from a vibrant child's world. A folded blanket on the couch and a few toys scattered on the floor showed that this house was, above all, a home. While Pedrinho slept in his room, Thiago and I settled in the living room. The rain drummed on the roof, filling the moments of silence between our words. At first, the conversation was light, revolving around the case and the upcoming hearings. But as time passed, the barrier that had always existed between us began to crumble. Thiago sighed, running a hand through his damp hair, and then began to speak. His voice, always calm, now carried a different weight. He confided about his financial struggles, the exhaustion of being both father and mother, and the constant fear of not being able to provide a better future for Pedrinho. Behind his calm demeanor and easy smile, he carried an immense burden. I, who had always seen myself as strong, as the provider, felt vulnerable listening to his words. There before me was a man who didn't ask for help, but whose burden was evident. For the first time, I allowed myself to see him beyond friendship, beyond the professional relationship that had brought us together. The glances between us grew more intense, charged with something neither of us dared to name. The tension in the air was palpable, almost electric, as if it were part of the storm outside. For a brief moment, I was certain that a single move would be enough to cross that invisible line. But we didn't, perhaps out of fear of what it would mean, perhaps out of uncertainty about what would come next. So I said goodbye and went to the hotel. The small inland town had a slow pace, with quiet streets and few entertainment options. The hotel where I stayed was simple but functional, with a modest breakfast and absolute silence at night, interrupted only by the distant sound of a car passing on the main street. My focus was work. Meetings were constant, and commuting back and forth to my city would be exhausting and impractical. So staying there for a while seemed like the best choice, and that was how Thiago came into my life. I had never felt this way about another man before. At 41, divorced for a few years, my life was a whirlwind with no room for relationships. Maybe it was just a physical need. Maybe it was the isolation of this different routine that awakened something in me. Thiago also had a busy life. He raised his son alone, with no time to get involved with anyone, even though he was a good-looking guy. That was his reality, just as it was mine. And perhaps it was precisely this lack of space for feelings that made this emerge so unexpectedly. The custody process for Pedrinho was progressing well, and that deserved a celebration. The town didn't have many leisure options, but the lake was one of the most beautiful places there. Surrounded by lush trees with a cool breeze and calm water reflecting the sky, it was the perfect setting for a peaceful day. On Saturday morning, I went to the market and picked out snacks and drinks for the picnic. As I walked through the aisles, I had the idea of getting Pedrinho a bicycle. He didn't have one yet, and I imagined it would be something special. The moment I took the bike out of the trunk, his eyes lit up with pure joy, as if he couldn't believe it was his. Thiago was also surprised, a disbelieving smile on his face. I didn't know who was happiest at that moment, Pedrinho, Thiago, or me. And so began the adventure of teaching him to ride the bike. The bicycle had training wheels, so he quickly gained confidence. At first, he went slowly, testing the pedals, feeling the motion. Within minutes, he was more relaxed, smiling as he made small trips between us. Thiago watched him with a look of pride and relief, as if that moment was rare amidst the hustle of daily life. I could only smile, feeling that this simple gesture had created something bigger between us. We were sitting on the grass, feeling the gentle breeze coming from the lake, creating small ripples on the water. The sun reflected on the calm surface, and the sound of birds mixed with the distant laughter of little Pedro, who was pedaling a bit further ahead, enthusiastically exploring his new bike. It was then that I felt Thiago's gaze on me. When I turned, his eyes were fixed on mine, filled with something I couldn't immediately decipher. He held my hand lightly, a supple but firm touch, enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin against mine. "Leonard, I'll always be grateful that you came into our lives. You haven't been here long, but you're already very important to us. Pedro really likes you. He calls you Uncle Leonard." Those words came with an unexpected weight, not because of the gratitude itself, but because of the way he said them, the intensity of the moment. I smiled, trying to brush off any misinterpretation. "You don't have to thank me, Thiago," I replied, returning the smile. He held my hand for a few seconds longer than necessary, and in that touch there was something beyond gratitude, something silent but present that made my heart beat differently. We were interrupted by Pedro's excited voice as he pedaled back toward us, smiling as if this were the happiest day of his life. Thiago let go of my hand gently, as if nothing had happened, and I took a deep breath, trying to reorganize my thoughts. We took a break to have a snack. I spread the towel on the grass, and soon we were sharing the sandwiches and juices I had bought. Pedro talked nonstop about how he wanted to learn to ride without the training wheels, how much he loved the bike, and how this had been the best gift of his life. I laughed at his exaggerated expressions, but inside, something weighed on me. As I watched the boy eat distractedly, I was struck by a thought I hadn't had in a long time. That scene, a father and son sharing a simple moment, stirred something in me that I hadn't expected. It reminded me of the time when I was still married. I had fought so hard to have a child. Years of attempts, tests, and frustrated expectations. In the end, that pain created a rift between me and my ex-wife, eroding everything until there was no repair. It wasn't the only reason for our divorce, but it was certainly one of the deepest. Seeing Pedro there, full of life, laughing with his father, brought me a mix of emotions. A tightness in my chest, a longing for what I never had, but also a strange feeling. Something new, something I couldn't yet name. That day was full of laughter and light moments. Between Pedro's pedaling, our casual conversations, and the pleasant weather by the lake, the morning passed in the blink of an eye. Before we knew it, the sun was high in the sky, and hunger began to set in. We decided to wrap up the picnic and around noon headed back. When we arrived at Thiago's house, he looked at me with an easy smile and said, "Stay for lunch." The question came without hesitation, but with a welcoming tone. I was curious about what he would prepare. I had no idea if he was a good cook, or if it would be something improvised, but I accepted the invitation without hesitation. After all, after that morning, the idea of extending that moment seemed like the best possible choice. Lunch was delicious, simple but made with care. We talked about everything and nothing at the same time, laughing about some moments from the morning and sharing stories from our daily lives. The atmosphere was light, comfortable, as if I were already part of that routine. After eating, Pedro took a quick shower and, exhausted from the busy morning, ended up falling asleep on the couch. Thiago picked him up with all the care of someone who did it instinctively and took him to his room. I stayed there, watching that natural gesture and feeling something grow inside me, something I didn't yet fully understand. When he returned and sat beside me on the couch, we continued talking. Gradually, the conversation shifted, becoming more intimate, quieter. Words gave way to glances that met without hurry, to pauses that said more than any sentence could. The atmosphere seemed charged with something new, something I couldn't name, but that was there between us. And then it happened. The kiss came naturally, without rush, without doubt. It was intense yet calm. New, different, but surprisingly right. It was a mix of emotions I couldn't explain. Desire, curiosity, perhaps even a deeper feeling I hadn't yet realized. All I knew was that in that moment, everything seemed to make sense. We returned to the living room in silence, still feeling the weight of that moment between us, but also careful not to wake Pedro. We sat on the couch, trying to act naturally, as if nothing had happened, but the tension between us was still there, pulsating in the air. It didn't take long for Pedro to appear at the bedroom door, rubbing his sleepy little eyes with that angelic face that so resembled his father's. His hair was still a bit messy from sleep, his expression slightly confused, like someone still waking up. It was impossible not to smile at the sight of him. I got up to leave. The time I spent there was good, more than good. But as I said goodbye to Thiago and Pedro, I felt something different. A genuine desire to stay, to remain there with them, as if that house had become a place I wanted to belong to. Still, I headed back to the hotel, carrying with me the memory of that day and the feeling that something important had changed inside me. 2 days passed, and the longing for Thiago began to tighten in a way I could no longer ignore. I took some time out of my routine and went to a mechanic's shop, knowing that Pedro was at school, which would give us a quieter moment to be together. When I arrived, there he was, as handsome as ever, with that serious demeanor but a different spark in his eyes when he saw me. His smile came easily sincere. "What a nice surprise," he said, putting down his tools for a moment. I didn't want to beat around the bush. I looked at him and let my heart speak. "I missed you. I decided to surprise you." Thiago smiled in a way that completely disarmed me. "I missed you too," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag before stepping closer. "I'm closing up the shop now, but I have a little time before picking up Pedro from school. Shall we go inside?" I accepted without hesitation. He closed the workshop, and there, away from the world's eyes, we allowed ourselves to ease the longing in the best way possible. The touch, the kiss, the way he held me, it all confirmed what I already knew, even if I hadn't said it out loud. I was in love, but I held on to that feeling, keeping it to myself. I knew this was new for both of us, and I didn't want to scare him or ruin what we were building. Time flew by, and soon it was time to pick up Pedro. We took advantage of the fact that my car was parked in front of the shop and went together. When we arrived at the school, we saw Pedro coming out through the gates. The moment he saw us, his eyes lit up, and he came running toward us with a huge smile on his face. "Uncle Leonard!" He jumped into my arms, hugging me tightly. I returned the hug affectionately and said, "I missed you, kiddo." He looked at me with that innocent expression and replied, "I missed you too, Uncle Leonard." That filled my heart with a joy I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about Thiago. It was about Pedro too. It was about belonging to something bigger than I had imagined. On the way back, we stopped at a restaurant to have lunch together. We talked, laughed, and everything felt so natural that, for a moment, I forgot any doubts or fears. When we finished, I took them both home, feeling that with each passing day, being with them was no longer a choice but becoming a necessity. The days went by, and our relationship grew more natural, stronger. I no longer tried to hide what I felt, but I also didn't force anything. I let it happen at the right pace, respecting Thiago's time and the newness this represented for both of us. Then, one day, he looked at me with seriousness but a soft glow in his eyes and said without hesitation, "I'm in love with you." The words hit me in a way I hadn't expected, even though I knew this moment would come. My heart raced and a smile escaped before I could say anything. "Thiago, I fell in love with you long before," I confessed, feeling a sweet relief at finally being able to say it out loud. He smiled, that sincere smile that always unraveled me, and pulled me into a kiss. It was a calm kiss, filled with everything we already knew but had only now put into words. When we pulled away, he looked at me with an amused expression and asked, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I chuckled lightly, running my fingers over his face. "I didn't want to scare you." He shook his head, still smiling, and said firmly, "You could never scare me. I love you, and Pedro loves you too." My chest filled with an indescribable warmth. I looked into his eyes and without hesitation replied, "I love you both too." In that moment, everything finally seemed to fall into place. 8 months had passed since that first day at the mechanic's shop, and a lot had changed. What started as an unexpected discovery had turned into something solid, a feeling that grew stronger every day. We were happy together, and now the natural desire to take the next step arose, living together. But it wasn't a simple decision. It wasn't just about the two of us. We had Pedro to think about. He was a smart and affectionate child, but we still wanted to make sure everything would happen as naturally as possible for him. We didn't want him to feel confused or think that something in his life was changing abruptly. So, we were taking it slow. We talked about it between ourselves, planning every detail, but always putting Pedro first. Gradually, we tried to introduce the idea, letting him realize spontaneously how much I was already part of their daily lives. The most curious thing was that, even without fully understanding the situation, Pedro already showed how much he liked having me around. Whenever I left at night, he would ask when I'd be back. On weekends, he wanted me around all the time. In a way, he already saw us as a family. The challenge now was to make this transition smooth and natural. More than anything, we wanted him to feel that this change didn't mean losing anything but gaining even more love and security. This is my story, and this is how I found my family. I hope you enjoyed listening. Thiago and Pedro weren't just a coincidence in my life. They gave me a new purpose, a reason to move forward with more meaning. Now it's no longer just me. Now, I fight for the three of us. Every day by their side has made me realize that family isn't about blood, but about love, about choice, about truly being present. Next week, we're going to visit a new house. Not just any house, but a home that will be ours. A place where we'll build our memories, where Pedro will grow up surrounded by love and security. I want to give him everything I would give to a child of my own if I had one. But in truth, I realized I don't need to wish for what could have been. He's already my son in my heart, just as Thiago is already my home. And so we move forward together, ready for whatever comes next. If you want to hear this story uncut, the link is in the pinned comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. With much love and care, Leonard.